So hello, I'm Iris de Rode, and I'm very happy to welcome you to the French-American Histories, One Story, Two Narratives. This is a program of virtual talks launched by the French Embassy to the French Embassy to the US in Washington, D.C., in partnership with Villa Albertine and the Fédération des Alliances Françaises of the United States of America. So I will give a short introduction and then, of course, introduce Olivier Zunz, who is here with me today to talk about Tocqueville. So life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and of course, liberté, égalité, fraternité, are the basis of the governing principles that have guided France and the United States, of course, since more than 2 centuries now. These ideals are also generally regarded as the cradles of modern democratic systems. And as the United States approaches the 250th anniversary of its founding in 2026, in which, of course, France played a pivotal role, it is vital today to examine the fundamental ideas that have facilitated the emergence and growth of these two prominent democracies. And so the series we are today recording, and so the interviews that will take place in the next coming months, will focus on these principles, the ideals that have bounded France and America for a long time, but of course have also evolved in different directions within the two different contexts and cultures. And so today we will talk with Olivier Zunz, but particularly about, of course, Tocqueville, because who else would be the person to talk about democracies from both in France and America, and especially as well its importance for us today. So the series French-American History will explore different facets, both of past and present, of the French-American dynamics that are taken place in a lot of different domains. And so we will record them every month, so stay tuned to hear for the next episodes. But so today, this month in October, I am very thrilled to host Professor Olivier Zunz on site here at the UVA, University of Virginia, where you have worked for an impressive number of years. And so we're today going to focus on the books you can see in front of me, the biography on Alexis de Tocqueville, which is entitled, of course, The Man Who Understood Democracy. This is, of course, a definitive biography on the French aristocrats that became one of democracy's greatest champions. So Olivier Zunz, I will now introduce you, is, of course, a James Madison Professor of History at the University of Virginia. And he is an internationally recognized expert on the life of Alexis de Tocqueville. As an editor of the Library of America edition of Democracy in America, Tocqueville's Recollections, but also Alexis de Tocqueville and Gustave de Meaux in America, and Tocqueville the Reader. So this is a vast and very extensive, of course, publications of the writings and the letters and the correspondences of Tocqueville. He has also written a number of books going from American as a corporate society towards particularly as well, of course, philanthropy as a phenomenon in the United States. But his most recent work is The Man Who Understood Democracy, the life of Alexis de Tocqueville, which is published by Princeton University Press in 2022, but also, as you can see, in a French edition by Fayard in France, of course, in the same year, 2022. And so Democracy in America is this, the authoritative biography of Tocqueville written by Olivier Zunz, is a beautifully written page-turner almost to really understand the life and the man behind the theories, of course, that most of us have heard of at least. He's, of course, one of the greatest political theorists of his time and especially as well of world history, as the sort of giant of democracy, we could call him. But we can also read in the book not just the theory and why these theories evolved and how he was writing them, we also learn about the man behind them. So the personal life of Tocqueville is, of course, a guiding principle in the book, but also guiding for the development of his ideas. And of course, one of the most important moments of Alexis de Tocqueville's life was his travel to America in 1831, when he was only 25 years old, and where he witnessed the exhilarating reality of a working democracy, which formed a contrast to what he witnessed, of course, in his own country, in France. And that's what I would like to start with today, to discuss Tocqueville's background, and then, of course, his American travel. His American travel, And of course then the development of his ideas and his thought and becoming this political theorist on democracy. And then of course going back to France and witnessing what happened to the French democracy, which really faced, of course, quite the challenges during this 19th century of whom he was a witness. So today in this interview, I would really like to start with, of course, first, why you wrote this biography, and particularly if your own experience as a Frenchman that is living in America has also inspired that interest for you to really understand Tocqueville as a man, and of course particularly his thought too.
I began reading Tocqueville when I was quite young. In the late 60s, I was fortunate enough to meet François Furet, who was a great historian of the French Revolution. Mm-hmm. I became close to him. He introduced me to Tocqueville's writings. And I've been a Tocqueville reader most of my life. I think it's important to read foundational text. And Tocqueville is a beautiful writer, a beautiful thinker. And I was attracted to his writing. Of course, having moved to this country, first in the late 60s and then establishing myself here in the 70s, I entertained a special intellectual relationship with Tocqueville, but most of my work was never really on Tocqueville. It was on the history of the United States in the 19th and 20th century, as you've mentioned earlier. But I remember all my life, I describe myself as a Sunday Tocquevillian. I was always, and when I joined the University of Virginia as a young professor back in 1978, there was a sociology professor teaching here by the name of Theodore Kaplow, who had the idea of creating a Tocqueville review. This was not really a scholarly journal on Tocqueville, but more using Tocqueville's name as a way to discuss social change, the comparative study of social change, France and the United States. And I joined in this venture, and this journal has now been published and still published for 45 straight years, which is quite amazing for a magazine. And in the process of editing the journal, I attracted a number of Tocquevillian specialists to contribute to Tocqueville scholarship. And then, as you pointed out, I got involved in translating with the publication of American translations of Tocqueville text. The work of my very good friend Arthur Goldhammer was a superb translator. So over the years, I became quite familiar with Tocqueville's papers. One thing that few people really realize is that, in addition, that Tocqueville was an incredible letter writer. He was an amazing correspondent. And I don't think there was a day in his life when he didn't write a letter to somebody, and they were superb letters. Now, Gallimard just finished publishing Tocqueville's complete works. There are 32 volumes in them.
And so Gallimard is a French publisher.
Gallimard is a French publisher. The publication of Tocqueville's complete works started in 1952, and it ended a year and a half ago, so nobody was in a hurry. But of the 32 volumes, 17 volumes are volumes of letters. Wow.
And I have heard that you have read them all, of course.
I think I have read them all. And I got caught into this letter. Tocqueville had a wonderful gift for epistolary friendships and developing his ideas in his letters and arguing with his correspondents. And so I got to know the man very well.
And as a biographer, would you maybe argue you even became close to him in your own way through a type of a friendship with the past, of course?
I think so. I think he was a very good person to dialogue with and imagine his answers to various questions or answer him in other ways. And I also came to befriend the Tocqueville family. The Tocqueville home is still in family hands. Mm-hmm. The papers are still in the home, and they let me use them. Of course, they've been duplicated and are available in archives, but it's different to see them on site. And then basically at the end of it, the long and short of it is that I'd never written a biography. I'd written a number of essays and books of history on different topics, but never written a biography. And I thought it was an interesting challenge. And many friends told me, well, you know so many things about this man, you really ought to do it. And I did.
Yeah. Very interesting. So yes, going through the letters, going through, of course, a lot of other type of documents, you really created the man that, of course, most people know only through his theories. So understanding his life is, of course, quite important to also understand why he would write, of course, the two important works that he wrote in his life, particularly, of course, on American democracy and another on Ancien Régime and the French Revolution in France. And so, of course, you kind of really showed that this was a real man. He grew up in France, a complicated France, because, of course, he was kind of rising again out of the ashes, we could say, of the French Revolution, which is, of course, the period in which Tocqueville grew up. So can you expand a little bit on his childhood, his environment of growing up, his aristocratic background in particular?
Well, Tocqueville came from the highest ranks of the French nobility, both the so-called nobility of the sword, the military nobility, and nobility of the robe, administrative families. His great-grandfather on his mother's side, the great Malesherbes. Malesherbes is not a household name in this country, but he was a brilliant man. He was a botanist. He was the director of the book trade, so in other words, the main censor under Louis XV, but in that job, he protected Rousseau and Voltaire from censorship, helped publish the encyclopedia. He was a liberal, promoting diversity, religious toleration, a new status for Protestants and Jews. But he also came out of retirement to be the king's lawyer during his trial, and of course paid for it with his life. As 10 members of the Tocqueville family were beheaded during the terror in 1794. So Tocqueville came out of this aristocratic milieu. Again, the highest ranks of the French nobility, and he was the only one in his family during his lifetime who questioned those values and became a Democrat. But at the same time, he was loyal to his family and friends, never broke with them, always maintained bonds of affection, and always, and you can see this in reading Democracy in America. Tocqueville always went out of his way, perhaps to show that, well, there's some great values in aristocratic system, in aristocratic, recognizing them, but then tilting the balance to show that in the end, democracy helped more people realize their goals in life, and that these people perhaps did not achieve the beauties of aristocratic grandeur, but they achieved something more, that is being themselves, and that was the beauty of democracy resided right there. Now, why did Tocqueville go to America? French liberals in those days, Tocqueville had trained as a lawyer. He had also followed the classes at the Sorbonne of the great historian and statesman François Guizot, and was well versed in British history. But somehow, after the 1830 revolution, the end of the absolute monarchy of Charles X, not knowing whether he could ever serve the new regime of a constitutional monarchy, not knowing really what his life would be like under a different political system, he decided to quit his job, and we can talk about what job that was in a second, and go to America to see what a democracy looked like.
So can you explain why? Because maybe for an American audience in particular, what had happened in France, because the French Revolution held the promise of bringing democracy, maybe in a similar way as the American Revolution had, but that of course did not work out that way. So what happened in the period between the 1789 revolution and then the 1830s when he decides to leave?
Well, Tocqueville was born in 1805.
Yeah.
So he was born long after the revolution. His parents, however, had been jailed during the terror, and they escaped the guillotine by one day. That is to say, they were scheduled to go to the scaffold, and the day before the fated date, Robespierre fell, and the regime ended, and the prisons were reopened, even though they remained in jail for several months. The revolution ended. It became actually one of Tocqueville's major themes, kind of a tragedy of French history, how the French were so passionate in bringing about revolutionary change to institute democratic norms, but could not hold on to this freedom and ended up putting in power some kind of dictatorial, authoritarian regime. Hence, the French Revolution ended in the consulate and the empire, and then after that, the monarchy was restored, and during the restoration of the monarchy, the Tocqueville family, of course, was rewarded. You know, how could that not be? They were the heirs of the great Malesherbes who had defended the king. So Tocqueville grew up in this milieu, but then the restoration of the Bourbon family ended poorly. That is to say, Louis XVIII respected the charter, but Charles X, who succeeded him, did not, ended up governing by ordinances, and reducing the electorate to its bare minimum, abusing his authority, and hence the revolution of 1830. Well, Tocqueville was born in 1805. After having been a brilliant student and an adventurous teenager, he went to law school during those Restoration years, and his father was a royal prefect, found a job for him as an apprentice prosecutor in the Versailles courthouse. Tocqueville was not very successful at that job. Everybody recognized he was intelligent, extremely intelligent, but he was not a good public speaker. His voice didn't carry, In those days, one didn't have microphones, and to be a prosecutor when your voice doesn't carry is not a great asset. No. He was passed up for promotion, and after the Revolution of 1830, when the junior branch of the family came to power, and Louis-Philippe instituted a constitutional monarchy, Tocqueville was still loyal to the Bourbons. He didn't know really what to do, what his future would be. The brilliant move, though, is that instead of going to visit England, which is where French liberals were going to see a constitutional monarchy, and of course that was what British history is what he had learned from Guizot, he decided he was going to bypass England altogether. He would eventually go there years later and see what a democratic regime really looks like. And hence the idea of going to America. He needed to find some reason for it so that he didn't want to lose his job quite yet. So instead of resigning from the courthouse, he asked for a leave of absence, he and his friend Gustave de Beaumont, a co-worker, in order to investigate American penitentiaries, American prisons.
So could you explain why prisons? Because if you say that his motivation is studying democracy, studying prisons could sound a little surprising.
Right. It's a very good point. It was a target of opportunity. There was a great deal of discussion in the press, in the reforming circles, about reforming the penal code, stop sending people to the scaffold, but and do away with the executioners, but instead reforming prisons, separating prisoners by degrees of offenses and by gender and so on and so forth, and age. And American penitentiaries were in the vanguard there. It was known in prison circles. So I think it was really a target of opportunity. They had an idea. How do we get there? And so they submitted a proposal to the Ministry of Justice. And I guess if you want to write a grand proposal these days to the NEH or the NIMH or the or wherever, the NSF, you ought to read their proposal because it was a masterpiece of how to make an argument. And they were granted the leave, and Beaumont and Tocqueville actually did write a short book, a documentary book on the American prison system and on various avenues of reform, and we can talk about that if you want.
Yes.
But Tocqueville always maintained that it was a pretext. It was a good pretext, it was a very honorable pretext, but it was a pretext. His real idea was to figure out how he, as an aristocrat, could ever live in a democracy. And he made some important discoveries in that process.
Yes. So you're explaining very clearly also in the book that it was really inspired by the French failures, or at least the problems that democracy had faced, but also, of course, this whole idea that he believed democracy to be an inevitable process, that it would lead automatically in the future to a democracy as a system, because of course the monarchical aristocratic powers were in decline and sort of equalities were rising. So he believed that that was really what he could find in America, perhaps, or at least he wanted to understand why democracy succeeded there. So could you maybe explain a little bit, before we start traveling with Alexis de Tocqueville through America, how the common vision of America was at the time? Because of course, about 50 years before, the French had participated in this creation of the Republic, the establishment of the democracy in America, because of the War of Independence that the French had, of course, participated in and won together. 50 years later, things have changed in both countries, of course. So is there sort of a positive image on America at the time? Is Tocqueville preparing for that trip? That was actually also the question I want to go to, is how does he prepare? Does he read a lot of books? Does he meet people that already had been? did he, for instance, talk to people such as Lafayette, who was, of course, one of the known, particularly here in the US, figures of that bringing democracy to both countries as a sort of a symbol. So how did he prepare for his travels, and how did other people see America at the time?
Well, there are about 3 or 4 questions in everything you said here, and so I'm going to take them serially. Yeah. Yes, of course, the French participated in the War of Independence in a critical way, but at the time of the French Revolution, the American Declaration of Independence first, and then the Constitution played a major role in the French debates. And actually, when Lafayette wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Man, he spent the evening before with Jefferson, who helped him out in drafting it. Yeah. So there was clearly an American, French-American reciprocity in creating these 2 regimes some years apart with some of the same actors. Now, the key word you used in your presentation here is the word equality. Now, for Tocqueville as an aristocrat, as a young aristocrat, equality was, if I may say, just a bad word. Yeah. It was something to be avoided at all costs. Why is that the case? Because equality was leveling. It was putting people down. Okay? It was not. It was the end of privileges for people like him, that is, aristocrats, where equality meant, well, I mean, if I have to be equal, then I'm losing my liberty, which is aristocratic liberty, the liberty of the few, only gained at the expense of the liberty of others, to be sure. So Tocqueville was of that mood about equality. What I think he discovered or realized, maybe is a better word, in visiting this country, that there was an other meaning for equality. Equality as giving more people chances to achieve their lives, to realize their potential, that it was a positive thing, not a negative thing, that it was not about leveling, it was about uplifting. And that, I think, was a major discovery, from which everything else follows. This realization, and how a society, with all of its defects, can believe in this as an ideal. And we can, of course, go further into that. Now, the third part of the question, was Tocqueville prepared for this? Absolutely not. First of all, he didn't speak English.
Yeah, that's the one of the real problems.
Yeah, he learned English on the boat.
It took how many weeks to go, though? So there were a few weeks. Well, it was not like today that you can travel fast. It took several weeks.
No, it took several weeks on the boat. There were some British and American travelers, of course, quite a few of them, on the packet boat, and they were quite patient with them. He also read treatises in economy and political economy, but by and large, he knew very little about this country when he arrived. Very little. But he was a fast learner, clearly, and interviewed about 200 Americans during his travels.
So can you explain when he arrived, or tell us when he arrived exactly, and then how did his travel go? He went from a lot of different places. And the question I want to ask there is, of course, he was only there for 9.5 months, so he couldn't see the entire United States. He couldn't meet all the people, so it was quite a selective trip in its own way. So how was he informed during his travels, and would you say that who he spoke to, the place he visited, really informed and probably also colored his thoughts on America?
Naturally so, since he had, it was limited in the number of people he could talk to. However, I think he talked to a very wide variety of people. That is to say, there has been the belief for a long time that Tocqueville talked mostly to the more aristocratic Americans, the elites. But in fact, if only because of the prison investigation, Tocqueville visited dozens of prisons. In the penitentiary in Philadelphia, he interviewed every prisoner in each cell. Okay, so I think he saw people. He traveled to the frontier. He wanted to meet pioneers and Native Americans. So yes, he saw a great many Whigs and conservative Americans, but he also saw people of all origins. Now, he arrived in Rhode Island, and interestingly enough, and then from there on, went to New York City, where they stayed. He and Beaumont stayed for several weeks. Then, after that, traveled to upstate New York, went to Albany, where he saw the Democratic machine actually running the government there, the local government. Then he traveled along the Erie Canal. When he was in New York, he had visited Sing Sing, the penitentiary. Then he went to see Auburn in upstate New York. From there on, moved on to the Great Lakes, stayed in Detroit. From Detroit, traveled through the Michigan forest. There's actually a beautiful text called 2 Weeks in the Wilderness, 15 jours dans le désert, where he narrates his trip through the wilderness. Went all the way to the frontier. Then from there on, returned east, went through the Niagara Falls, then into Quebec for a while. Then went to Boston from there, where he met with the Boston aristocracy, the John Quincy Adams, former president, Jared Sparks, the first Harvard history professor, many other important figures in Boston. Then returned down the East Coast, quickly through New York and then Philadelphia. Then from there on, moved to along the Ohio, and then down the Mississippi to New Orleans, and back to the south to Washington, D.C. A brief encounter with Andrew Jackson, the president. He was not impressed with him, and then back to France.
A long voyage of nine and a half months
yes.
that he's done. And so there is this quote in your book from Sainte-Beuve that said that he saw things before he knew anything, which I think is quite telling because, of course, he is 25, and as you have explained, he was not that well prepared. Did that lead to gaps in his understanding? Did that maybe lead to a very French lens, you could say, of the understanding that he would, of course, later write in his books?
Well, let me answer this question perhaps in a slightly more abstract fashion, maybe a little more complicated fashion, but as I've lived it as being a biographer. Okay. Well, there are some features about Tocqueville's, how his mind operated. Yes, of course. So Sainte-Beuve said that Tocqueville learned how to think before he knew anything. So And there's a little bit of a mystery as how much Tocqueville really read. That is to say, he was not a voracious reader. In his notes, you'd find very few reading notes. At some point, when after Democracy in America, Tocqueville was elected to the Académie des Sciences Morales et Politiques, the French Academy of Political and Moral Sciences, he hired as his research assistant the young Gobineau, who later became infamous for the essay on the inequality of races. And Gobineau prepared a lot of summaries, book summaries for him.
So he would only read the summaries.
He would only read the summary. I think his preferred method he read mostly for style. Tocqueville was an obsessive, compulsive rewriter. He has sometimes written the same sentence 17 times until he reached perfect harmony in style, which is interesting too because his perfecting of style did not necessarily improve the meaning. Sometimes he could remain obscure in his meaning with a perfect stylistic phrase, which is interesting in and of itself when you think of it. Now, his preferred method of learning was interviewing people, taking notes on the ground as he went, recording his impressions, and taking it from there. Now, often, and this is where I wanted to go, often Tocqueville made very partial observations or frankly inaccurate observations or missed amazing things in front of his eyes. For example, I cannot figure out for the life of me how Tocqueville could, in late 1831, travel along the Erie Canal and never hear of the Second Great Awakening and the evangelical revival that was taking place in every canal town.
And in particular, because of his own interest in religion, even before, yes.
So I think Tocqueville, in writing, missed completely, in his investigation of America, missed completely not only evangelical religion, but the democratizing influence of evangelical religion. And yet, in his book, he comes down with the right judgment on religion. That is that America has found a unique way of keeping religion and politics in separate spheres. And that's the way it should be for the sake of politics and for the sake of religion. And I think it's typical of Tocqueville, that is to say, he relies only on observation in order to come down with the correct judgment. I would say it is the power of intelligence, in a nutshell, right?
And how would you then,
You know, it boils down to that.
Yeah, but how would you explain these gaps then, or the fact he overlooked that type of quite probably obvious things in front of his eyes?
Well, it's partly depend on who he met, who he talked to. In terms of the religion, his investigation of religion, he talked to a good many Catholic priests in America who even almost convinced him that Catholicism was going to be the dominant religion here. I think the reason why he talked to a lot of Catholics, because this young man of age 25 wanted to reassure his mom that he was going to church on Sunday, and so he could write letters to his mother, say he talked to such and such priest in New York. Also in Boston, he talked to the kind of proto-Whig, anti-Jacksonian politicians. Many of them were allied to the Unitarian Church. The Unitarian Church was actually expanding quite a bit, and he thought that was the future of American Protestantism. So, in other words, his notes on religion are highly deficient. the text in Democracy in America is right on the money. So go figure.
The money. So I thought it was particularly interesting to read the whole description of because you just said too, the rewriter Tocqueville. So the fact he was always crafting his words and working to really get his points through, but that whole evolution of his thought from the small description when he's just having dinner and describing what people are eating or wearing towards these bigger philosophies. Can you explain, because of course Democracy in America is written in 2 volumes. How is that written and how long did that take? And then we'll dive into the theory, of course, more.
Well, I think I want to answer this question by adding a little bit to it. Democracy in America is a brilliant book, but it's a mess of a book. Mm-hmm. It goes everywhere. There are some chapters that are long, some that are very short. There are a lot of digressions, so on and so forth. Tocqueville died young. He was 53, died of tuberculosis in 1859. He was born in 1805. He died before he turned 54. His last book, The Old Regime, is a masterpiece of balance. There's not an extra sentence in it. Everything is perfectly calibrated. Democracy in America is a young man's book. I can't say that Tocqueville was old when he wrote The Old Regime, but he was a seasoned writer and had spent his life writing speeches and reports and so on and so forth. Now, the 1835 volume, he came here in 1831-32. When he returned to France, Tocqueville was prone to depression. He was prone to depression. He had a hard time recovering his balance when he returned to France. It took him a year and a half to even assemble his notes. And he had several trunks of them. When he returned to France, he finally got to work on his first book. His first book, the 1835 volume, is very close to his travel notes. Mm-hmm. You actually can find entire sections of his travel notes in the book itself. It's close to the many interviews he conducted, and of course he reflected on the larger meaning in so many ways. But it's as much descriptions as it is reflections. Also, one of the reasons it became an instant success is that it was read by people in the chamber and French members of the legal professions, lawyers and politicians, as kind of a textbook on America. That is, people were curious to know, how does this thing work? Mm-hmm. And Tocqueville explained it. Now, Tocqueville then felt the need to rewrite the book a second time and to actually come up with a much broader theory of democracy, more abstract, more difficult to follow, often credited to be one of the sort of precursors of modern social science, when the first book was considered to be more descriptive of a political system. I think both books are brilliant, but they are written in different mode. Mm-hmm. Now, John Stuart Mill, Tocqueville's British friend, whom Tocqueville greatly influenced actually, thought of the second volume as the first genuine theory of democracy. And in some way it is.
So what would you...
modern democracy.
Yeah, modern democracy, yes. So what would you want to highlight, since, of course, there's so much to say about both books, but particularly, of course, there's a few of the main conclusions he held, the famous parts of tyranny of the majority, the famous parts on, of course, equality, like all these differences. But if you have to highlight one here tonight, which one would be for you the main takeaway, let's say, of democracy in America?
Okay. I think, to me, personally, the main takeaway, and the one I think people should really think about, is that democracy is fragile.
Mm-hmm.
It is a demanding political system. It can easily get out of balance. And it is every citizen's duty, in a way, to make it work. I think in some ways, in today's world, you feel this very, very much. So, as I say in the book, of course, Tocqueville, as a young aristocrat who wanted to stay friends with his aristocratic family and childhood friends and his larger connections, and was himself torn between aristocratic feelings and democratic realities. He used to say, I'm an aristocrat by instinct, but a democrat by reason. Mm-hmm. Shows all of these ambivalencies, including the tyranny of the majority, on which we may come back in a second. But ultimately, he's remembered not for his equivocations, but for his convictions. Mm-hmm. And his convictions that, yes, democracy is here to stay, because it is, after all, a system that will give the greater number of people the maximum number of chances. Mm-hmm. But it can easily get out of kilter. It can be abused, and therefore one must be incredibly vigilant.
Mm-hmm. Good lessons for today, indeed.
Good lessons for today.
Yes. So about, of course, he's in America, he's traveling also to the South. He's seeing, of course, particularly the institution of slavery, but also the treatment of Native Americans at the time of the westward expansion, and of course the Trail of Tears. So can you comment on how he understood that in that light of the equality that he was hoping to find, of course, in America, and the lessons for France, and then that huge paradox that you find within that system? Well,
Tocqueville had 3 encounters with Native Americans. The first one was in upstate New York, when he saw several of them drunk, depraved, begging, and was unimpressed. Said, where did Chateaubriand meet Atala? Where is the noble savage of Rousseau? How could it be? So there was his first encounter. The second encounter was on the Great Lakes, when he went to the frontier, where there he met with people closer to his image of the Native American in his or her own habitat or natural environment. And the third encounter was in witnessing the Trail of Tears, that is, in going down the Mississippi and seeing the Choctaw Indians forced to cross the Mississippi River in order to move to a reservation. Tocqueville was never terribly charitable towards Native Americans. He felt that even though what he saw was tragic, it was probably inevitable. And he pretty much left it at that. He condemned the Indian genocide, but in rather weak terms, in the sense that he didn't see a way to prevent it from happening.
And then slavery, the other...
Slavery, Tocqueville did not witness large-scale slavery during his trip. He had to go to the South rather quickly because the French ministry recalled them, ended their leave of absence. He did meet some small slave owners in the Kentucky, Tennessee countryside.
Mm-hmm.
You know, poor whites owning 2 or 3 slaves, because even poor whites own slaves, but never saw plantation slavery. Tocqueville was an abolitionist, and in his political life in France, campaigned for the abolition of slavery in the French Caribbean. Mm-hmm. He was a genuine abolitionist. He was clearly concerned with slavery in this country, thought it was the potential for what actually happened. Yeah. Was in touch with,
which was the Civil War,
which was the Civil War. Was in close contact with Charles Sumner, another American abolitionist. But again, he made the decision in his book on democracy in America, mm-hmm. to treat race as a separate chapter, in the sense that he couldn't recognize democracy in race relations. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, contrary to a number of observers, like his friend Beaumont, he saw enough in American democracy so that he could praise it while treating race somewhat separately. So how tenable is this is, of course, an open question.
Mm-hmm. And so, as you just have mentioned, he had a political career after his return, but he also, of course, became quite the proponent, despite being an abolitionist, for colonialism and a strong sense of nationalism in France. Can you maybe comment on that, also to go to the conclusion of this interview and to turn to some questions of the audience? But how did he reconcile these two?
Well, I don't think he reconciled them, mm-hmm. But he assumed that these contradictory positions. I don't think he attempted to reconcile them. I think Tocqueville was a very strong nationalist, and he saw in the Algerian conquest a way to keep French power in the Mediterranean, mm-hmm. To compete successfully with England in the Middle East, to maintain France's place in the world. He also saw, perhaps it was an illusion, but it was entertained by a number of people, that the conquest was not necessarily a displacement of native population. After all, the density was mm-hmm. low, the land was plentiful, and these two populations could coexist. He believed that. Even though he supported the violence of the French conquest, no excuse there. But he did see in the colonization of Algeria a chance to move a languishing French population out of mediocrity and perhaps do something more significant with their life by establishing a new country. A little bit like the Midwest or the mm-hmm. West mm-hmm. had worked for American pioneers.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And as for, of course, the work he's done for the American democracy, were there lessons for him to be learned as he had hoped to find before going on his travels? He was hoping to find answers to some of the French issues, but also, of course, did he see America as a model for France?
Well, in a nutshell, partly yes. Mm-hmm. That is to say, Tocqueville had a political career. We don't have really a chance to go into it in detail.
That's why people will have to read your book.
But he served as a member of the Constitutional Committee for the Second Republic. That is to say, in 1848, he was, after the Revolution of 1848, he was on the committee that wrote the Constitution. We wrote the French Constitution. And there he very much wanted to adopt a bicameral legislature and a number of features of the American Constitution. And by and large, he failed in this regard, but that's what he was hoping to do. He was, but on the other hand, he was a latecomer to the idea of universal suffrage, even though he ended up adopting it in 1848 and running successfully for re-election under it. So the answer is, in a larger, broader sense of a political system giving opportunity, the answer was yes. In a more narrow institutional system, the answer was partly.
And so if you have, because we will have to conclude and then of course also go to some questions, if that will work, that's... so the main lessons, because of course the end of his life was, well, what would have happened, of course, after he did not necessarily know, but there was quite the collapse of both France and the American system, and particularly the coming of the Civil War that he, of course, did not witness. But overall, after that, of course, democracies were reinstalled and survived up until today. And would you consider there's lessons for us today still to learn from Tocqueville, and in particular yourself as also maybe a representative of Tocqueville's thought, but also one who really understands it so well, but also as a Frenchman that lives here? Is there one big lesson we can still apply to today's world from Tocqueville and the 1830s that he studied at the time?
Well, from the 1830s, I don't know, because we're in a different world. But the spirit of democracy, the inspiration, the need for it, the answer is a resounding yes. And having taught democracy in America to young people for many, many years, there's something of a miracle of sorts that Tocqueville still reads as a contemporary writer. There are a few sentences that perhaps date him, but by and large he's talking to you. And that is remarkable.
Yes. And do you have one of his main lessons then, something inspiring to finish today? Because of course people might argue that both French and American democracies now are in quite the threat. There is a threat of probably even a decline of it. Some people would argue. So would you...
Well, the same thing happened during Tocqueville's days.
Exactly, that's why it's so interesting.
The same thing happened during Tocqueville's days. And so I think Tocqueville is a lesson in hope.
Yes. So also I think that your book in general is also a lesson in hope to understand that thought, to go really deep in it for the several topics we've covered today, which was of course not at all exhaustive, and you should read the book if you're very interested in the subject, and all Tocqueville's work, and probably his correspondence too on top. But I do believe indeed that it is important to think about these values and democracies and all the different complexities and fragility of it, as he's describing so well. I have a question by Tom, who's asking about, we're going to the topic of prisons here, which is of course the main subject of Tocqueville's research. So the question is, was Tocqueville influenced by the report on the prisons of Philadelphia by La Rochefoucauld-Liancourt in 1795?
I don't know the answer to this. I think Tocqueville knew about this report by La Rochefoucauld-Liancourt. I don't know whether he read it or not. One thing that he knew, I mean, he investigated the Philadelphia penitentiary in great detail. He understood its origins with the Quakers, its emphasis on reform, and on, of course, solitary confinement, which was quite controversial. And Tocqueville ended up supporting solitary confinement as perhaps the best hope for possible rehabilitation. But as we have said earlier about Tocqueville's reading, I don't know of any notes that he had on La Rochefoucauld-Liancourt.
Yes, so, but there he probably has. You would.
No, not necessarily. Not necessarily. No.
Okay, so another question comes from an anonymous spectator. It says here on my screen, but anyway, does he have any influence on politics today? Is there any direct influence of Tocqueville's political theories on politics?
Well, I'm going to have to say again, I don't really know.
Yeah.
but it's all the rage. That is to say, people are aware of Tocqueville as somebody who fought for democracy and believed that participation was key. And so I think there is a, I don't know how, I don't think he's that influential in the sense that Tocqueville was somebody who wanted to dialogue. And that I think that ability is rare these days. But I think he's maintained a presence, a force. There's a sense of evocation. His name evocates something.
And might inspire thought about our world. Yes. And talking about our today's world, there is a maybe more challenging question, but given the past week on Capitol Hill, how would he address the tyranny of the minority?
Okay. Well, of course, Tocqueville was known for arguing about the tyranny of the majority. And this all came when Jared Sparks, a Unitarian minister in Boston, told him, well, you know, in this country, the dogma is that the majority is always right. Well, and Tocqueville ran with the idea, to the great displeasure of many of his American friends who said, no, this is just an exaggeration. There is no tyranny of the majority. There is a tyranny of the minority that we see today. We've seen it this week, that's for sure. Now, in a sense, I think it's not something that Tocqueville feared. But it is something that Madison feared and that Washington feared. I mean, Madison talked about factions. And the only way for Madison one could escape the tyranny of faction was to multiply factions so that they could cancel each other out. Washington, in his farewell address, still condemned faction as paralyzing government, as we are seeing in front of our eyes. Tocqueville, in a sense, changed the conversation because he moved from faction to association. And so I think the tyranny of the minority is not in the Tocquevillian lexicon.
But so are there maybe, because he is actually studying America because of sort of this counterbalance to France and to a certain collapse of a democracy, So is there maybe a lesson we can learn today from that? Like what would Tocqueville say to recover the democratic spirit in the United States, but also in France today?
I think you're going to have to ask him.
We have to ask him.
Yes.
Absolutely true. So there is a question here on Lafayette. So what do we know about their relationship? And this person is also mentioning that they would not have agreed on solitary confinement, but that's maybe a larger topic. But did they know each other? Did they ever meet?
Well, they were very much aware of each other. Now, of course, it's not the same generation.
No.
Lafayette came much earlier. Tocqueville sought Lafayette out in order to get a letter of recommendation on his trip to America. He collected several dozen letters of recommendation. He didn't use any of them. Mm-hmm. I think a member of the Lafayette household ended up writing to Fenimore Cooper about Tocqueville's visit. I don't know if anything came of it. At first, when Tocqueville first arrived, and Americans had dinners in New York, toasted Lafayette.
Yeah. You mentioned that he was a little...
he was ambivalent,
yeah.
Because he hadn't yet turned Democrat. Mm-hmm. I think, on balance, Tocqueville was an admirer. Tocqueville joined the National Guard. I don't think they have any, they were of a different generation, but Tocqueville had a respect for Lafayette that was very clear.
Mm-hmm. And we have not talked much about this in the interview, but of course one of the main themes of Tocqueville is the idea of voluntarism, the civic society, the participation of people in different groups, and particularly in America, he sees that, of course, the participation. And so he's talking about voluntarism here, so the joining of organizations. Do you see a darker side? Well, this is maybe a question that Tocqueville would not be able to answer, but could you maybe expand on what he did see there as for the participation of the population of America in local institutions and initiatives, and the importance of that for the maintenance of a democracy?
Tocqueville's bête noire really was centralization. He hated the idea of centralization. Mm-hmm. And he wanted a strong government, but administrative centralization was stealing local energy. Yeah. There may be a sense of the aristocrat losing local autonomy, and of course Tocqueville blamed the French kings for voiding aristocracy of its natural usefulness by running localities and taking them to court. But by and large, Tocqueville celebrated and saw the positive value in voluntary associations. Now, of course, the KKK is a voluntary association, so there's a dark side to voluntary associations. And Tocqueville knew it as well as anybody, but he still favored the impulse of supplementing individual energies through voluntary associations. Mm-hmm. That individualism by itself was not enough, but the combining of energies could only bring creativity and serve as a safeguard against autocracy. Mm-hmm. And that is perhaps what Tocqueville is best known for. Mm-hmm. He's as a theorist of not just of democracy but of civil society.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. I have two last questions. The first will be about the electoral college system. So did he comment on that?
He commented on that, but not extensively. He favored it. didn't really explain why, except that it was one more intermediate channels that would avoid sort of the excesses of the crowd. Mm-hmm. But that's about as far as he went.
Yeah, so no lessons for us today there.
No lessons for us there.
And then the last question that is a good one to end and wrap it up with is about his own political life. Of course, his theories, did he apply them in his own political career, and how successful was that? I would want to add.
Okay, so it's often said that Tocqueville was not a very successful politician, which I think we can argue with. As I said, he was not a very good public speaker, didn't have the qualities of a leader, but he was highly respected for his intelligence, and he was influential. So that is, just repeat the question for a second.
So the question was on how did he apply his theories that he had developed in his writings into the practical side of his political career.
So it's the other way around. So his political career, of course, was influential in limited ways. In prison reform, the issue of solitary confinement, of course, is a debatable issue, and Tocqueville was of two minds on this, even though he ended up supporting the Philadelphia system. But his fight for abolition, his number of reforms that he championed. But I think it's the other way around in the sense that his work as a politician dramatically improved his theoretical writing.
Interesting. So it was a mix between the practice.
It was a mix between the two, and I think he very much wanted. He knew that he had difficulties in the chamber. He couldn't be heard easily. His speeches were better listened to, read than listened to. But making the political argument for a practical purpose really helped him formulating the theory.
That's interesting that he did both sides and that enforced him.
Yeah.
And so we will conclude right now. So thank you so much for this interview and for accepting to be part of.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much.
It was fun.
And I just want to show the books because one of the spectators asked if we could show them more clearly. So in both French and English, they are available. And of course, we have just touched upon a few details of these two, well, the same, the biography that's here in front of us. But of course, the life of Tocqueville is one of the more influential lives, of course, of particularly political theory. And the lessons of his work are, of course, valuable today. And Olivier Zunz's magnificent work to write that and to teach us about the man behind the theory, of course, is very interesting. And then as well, accompanied by all these edited volumes. So thank you so much for this, and I hope it really also fit in this idea that we want to emphasize on here with this series, which is really to emphasize on both sides of the Atlantic have similar principles, similar ideas, but they have evolved in different ways, and they both serve as examples and inspirations for us today. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much.